Welcome to our webinar, Avoiding Social Media Lawsuits. We're going to go ahead and get started. And with that, I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping. So this is Robert Wilburn from Archive Social. If you haven't done a webinar with us before, just a quick reminder, all attendees are on mute. So if you talk into your microphone, we won't hear you. However, feel free to use the question function to ask questions. So if you look over on the right in your panel, there's a little questions tab. You can open that up, submit a question, and you can either send it privately just to the moderators, or you can send it to the whole group. There will be time for Q&A throughout the presentation. So if you have a question about something our speaker is talking about, definitely just enter it in and we'll pause every 3 or 4 slides. There will also be time for a question and answer at the end of the presentation. And then finally, the webinar is recorded and you'll receive a copy via email. I know we've already gotten a question on that. So we'll send a follow-up email after the webinar. It'll come out the next day or so. You'll see a link to some of the resources that Anil speaks about, as well as a link to the page where you can see the recording. Okay, and so with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. So our speaker is Anil Chawla, founder and CEO of Archive Social. Anil speaks around the country at different conferences and is really a subject matter expert on this issue of social media records management as it relates to government and education agencies. If you're at 3CMA this year or at NAGWA, you'll hear Anil speak. We also spoke recently at the International Institute of Municipal Clerks. So he's out and around the country speaking on this issue. About Archive Social, so Archive Social works with more than 1,500 agencies around the country, and that's really the backdrop for a lot of this presentation. So we work with agencies both small and large, everything from the smallest towns to the largest cities like New York City, Chicago, et We also, as you'll see in that last bullet, launched the first open archive of social media for US President with the outgoing Obama administration. So this is an issue that we are invested in on a day-to-day basis and super excited to introduce Anil.
Well, great. Thank you, Robert, for the introduction here, and thank you all for joining us. We have quite an audience, so we appreciate you taking the time on Tuesday, whether it's a morning or an afternoon for you. I'm excited to connect with you here today on this issue of avoiding lawsuits, and very transparently to level set with all of you before I jump into the material. Oftentimes, as a presenter, many of you have presented before, we're given advice to use humor to make the audience laugh. I'll be honest with you all that with a presentation that has the word lawsuits in the title, that's kind of hard to do. So very transparently, this is a presentation where we are going to talk about legal risks. We're going to talk about those challenging issues. It might come across a little bit scary. And really to level set before we go into that information, I want to talk about why this is so important. And this is not hopefully a surprise to anyone who's tuned in to us to this presentation today, that social media has fundamentally become a core channel for government to serve, protect, and inform the public. Whether you are sending out the lip sync video that's become quite popular these days, or you're in the middle of a crisis now, and that audience that you built over time using engaging content is there to help you share that official message, to help you get information out that's critical. Social media is playing a front and center role for government. And with something that's so important, that's so central, just like government itself is, comes risk, comes the potential for a lawsuit. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. We are going to go through a set of circumstances, and I'm really going to boil it down to two major parts in this presentation. One, what are the actual legal risks facing public agencies on social media today? And then two, how can we avoid it? How can we address it? How can we be proactive? And now I also want to add that in this conversation, as we talk about legal risk, the notion of record keeping does come up, archiving comes up. It's obviously an area of expertise for us. So for those of you who are interested, who have questions on this, we will take a moment or two at the end of today's presentation to talk about archiving at a high level, to give everybody practical guidance. But throughout, our goal here is to be a resource to you, to arm you with information about what's happening in the industry around you, which may or may not have been national news, and then give you some actionable items to protect your agency. And on that note, As you have questions, as I'm sure many of you will, please do use the questions option in the GoToWebinar window. You can add questions as we go. We will monitor those. We will try to answer them as we go, and want to keep this as interactive as possible and as valuable and resourceful to you as possible. So with that, speaking of risk, what I'm going to do is try out the poll feature in this webinar console and see if it works for us here today. What we want to do is get a sense from all of you before I dive in, how you view current sets of issues that we keep hearing about from various agencies. And in a moment here, I will put up on my console the actual poll, and you should be able to see it now. What risks are you most concerned about with your current use of social media? And we want you to select one. Is it use of social media by public officials? Is it the third-party comments and the need to potentially moderate or remove that commentary? Is it public records compliance? So pick one of those three options. I will wait just a few more moments here, and we're seeing the responses come in quite rapidly. And once we have a majority of votes in, we'll go ahead and share the results back out to the audience. Okay, so as you can see, more than half of you identified the third-party comments, the need to moderate as a major issue, a major risk. So we'll definitely spend some time on that. But all of these issues have some interest, public records compliance, more than almost a third of you. So that really helps me get ready to jump into the content. And fortunately, we've had these types of discussions before and understand that this issue of third-party content moderation is top of mind. So that is actually the first bridge that we're going to cross in this discussion today. So what are the major risks, legal risks that agencies are facing on social media? Let's start with that number one out of that poll. And we'll package this up in a topic that we call First Amendment concerns. And essentially, this is an area where we're seeing legal requests, lawsuits, other issues related to third-party comments that are then deleted or hidden by a public agency or public official, then leading to some kind of complaint or issue. Now, I'm going to step back in time a little bit to talk about this issue because it's something that we see quite often these days, but it actually has a bit of history to it. And in 2012, we actually saw our very first lawsuit involving government social media, and it was exactly on this issue of First Amendment concerns. So what happened in this situation is that the Honolulu Police Department was active on Facebook, it still is, and during their use of Facebook, a citizen was frequently posting about gun ownership, gun rights. Now, that being a controversial issue, the police department decided to remove certain comments. And at that time on Facebook, you could only delete, not hide, and eventually block the citizen. The citizen then joined with an advocacy group, the Hawaii Defense Foundation, filed a lawsuit alleging First Amendment violation. Very interesting case for the industry. No case law to that point on whether or not government agencies and public officials can remove third-party content. Unfortunately, this case did not play through. We did not get to see it ruled upon. And at the time, because Honolulu had a draft social media policy, but not a published social media policy, a decision was made to go ahead and settle the case, pay the attorney fees for the plaintiff, and really establish an open social media policy allowing anything to fly at that time. So real lesson learned here is that it is critical to have a social media policy in place. This is, again, a case out of 2012. So we'll talk about this later on in the presentation of getting a social media policy in place if you need help with that. But having that policy in place could have changed the trajectory of a circumstance like this. And then certainly whenever there's legal risk and content's been deleted, you have to think about record keeping. Fast forward 6 years later, we've seen lawsuits like this time and time again, and they have picked up at an increasing pace. Notably, organizations such as the ACLU have gotten involved. In Indiana, for example, the Indiana chapter of the ACLU filed three separate lawsuits related to social media comments being deleted. And again, this affects all types of agencies, not just law enforcement. We see it again with an animal shelter, as you see it on the screen as an example. Now, what's really making this issue show up in mainstream news as a headline is the fact that public officials are more and more active on social media. We see that from the president on down. And that's by and large a great trend in terms of transparency and accessibility for public officials to be on social media. But again, with anything that's important comes risk, comes the other side of the equation. And public officials being so prominent and high profile, anytime they are being accused of First Amendment violation, anytime they're blocking social media users, removing comments, it's being picked up by the media, and it's at all levels of media, creating a lot of awareness to this issue throughout government. So by these public officials running into this issue, this will certainly affect public agencies. And an important case just settled earlier this year involved the Maryland governor who was, again, faced a lawsuit for allegedly violating First Amendment, essentially blocking users, deleting comments, moderating comments, hiding them. And again, the ACLU in Maryland, in this case, pursued it. This case is important because it was settled, and there were some key provisions that the governor's office agreed to. And some that are generally helpful, I think, to agencies across the board. So being able to say, look, we do not discriminate based on viewpoint. That's a really important thing to be able to say. And I'll talk more about having a clean comment moderation policy in a moment. But putting that in the policy and making it clear that you do not discriminate based on viewpoint, but that you can remove disruptively repetitive content, right? So giving some clear lines here on how agencies can approach this issue. And then of course, in relevance to record keeping, any content that's removed by the policy will be retained for 1 year. So establishing that retention schedule for content, very important, sets a good precedent for others to look at. All right, let me get into the next type of risk that agencies face. And this is one that's particularly relevant to social media. And it's the notion of getting caught in a firestorm, going viral. Now, before I give you some of the scarier examples, I do want to highlight this, what I thought was a really neat example, really inspiring example of a teacher who wanted to show her third grade class the power of social media. And she simply tweeted, "I want to show this to my class, retweet it, please." And it was retweeted well over 200,000 times. So this is a case of being viral on purpose. As we all know, that's not generally how public agencies go viral, and unfortunately. So let's take a look at just two examples here to paint a picture of what it means to go viral, how we've seen this play out. This first example is something that was reported upon in the local news in Washington involving the Skagit County Sheriff. Essentially, this is a situation where sharing circumstance really triggered some high emotions and caused the post to go viral. The members of the sheriff's office were having lunch at a local establishment, and when paying for their bill, they were told not to come back, and that the owner's son did not want any law enforcement to come to their restaurant. The sheriff got wind of this and put it on the official Facebook page and basically recounted the story, saying that they were told not to come back. As you can imagine, this set off a firestorm where people were both supportive of law enforcement and against. The people that were a fringe segment of the people supportive then began to threaten that local business because the local business was named. And so this really took off and became a big incident. 3 million views, shared 40,000 times, 30,000 comments. And so this is something that I don't think the sheriff intended to become a big distraction, but it did. And it created a lot of risk. The Skagit County communications officer at the time, fortunately, understood some actions to take and took those actions to get ahead of a potential records request or lawsuit in the future. But again, something can get out of hand pretty quick despite your intentions. Now, to make that point even more clear that something can go viral even when you don't expect it to, I want to tell you the story of South Daytona, Florida. This is now just from a few years ago, where this is a town of 12,000 in population, a very modest social media presence, maybe a few post comments a week. And here's what happened. A person decided to post on their own private social media, not on the government page, but on their own private social media, this photo of a dog's mouth being duct taped. Now, fortunately, this person's friends knew better, thought this was distasteful, and began to share it across social media. And I'll take this picture off of our view here for a second. And this went viral. It went out of someone's own personal Facebook page, and it went viral because it was shared so much. And because this person's Facebook profile had their location at South Daytona, Florida, the virtual mob showed up on the Facebook page for South Daytona, Florida, asking the city, what are you doing about this? How can you let this happen? This is animal cruelty, and we expect law enforcement to do more about this. And it was a negative tone. Now, to the credit of social media, South Daytona, despite the fact that they're a small town, limited resources, used social media to immediately address the situation, communicated frequently, transparently, let citizens know about progress, ultimately tracked this person down, and she was arrested. In this time, this town that's getting very few social media comments in a week gets more than 24,000 comments in just a few days, has national media issuing records requests for that situation. Here's the kicker. South Daytona, Florida, who had to deal with this situation, was not the location of the person who posted it. She had forgotten to update her social media profile. So they were pulled into a viral situation that it really had no relevance to. So a viral situation can affect anybody at any time. Again, because of the important role that government plays in society, we do often see public agencies get pulled into controversial situations, whether or not the agency had anything to do with it. So that gives us two risks. Again, we talked about First Amendment concerns. We talked about viral situations getting caught in a firestorm. Again, if you have questions about these circumstances or the general premise here, please do add them to the GoToWebinar window. I'm going to wrap up with our number 3, and this is where it all comes together. Regardless of the circumstance, government, when put into a difficult circumstance, a legal situation, will be asked to tell its story. You have to provide evidence of what you've done. It comes back to record keeping, producing records, public records. And the reality of today's situation is that the majority of public agencies are actually not in full compliance with public records laws. Maybe unaware of that, maybe unaware of the risk, maybe relying on the social networks themselves, Facebook and others, to have this data, and not recognizing that the networks do not provide the level of record keeping necessary to fulfill public records requirements, do not recognize how much content is being deleted by either your agency or by the citizens, and that perhaps even when you are receiving records requests today, that your social media is actually a part of a records request that you're receiving. And I'll talk about how that happens here in a moment. So to set the stage for this, I mentioned public records, and this is an area where there was a lot of questions, I would say 5, 6, 7 years ago, in terms of social media constituting public record. Over the years, state after state has made it abundantly clear that social media is public record, just like any other electronic communication, your email, your websites, anything else. And in order to paint this picture very clearly, and we'll take an example from one state, California, the public records laws that are in existence, that have been in existence for decades now, were written in an open-ended fashion to account for the changing nature of communication. A key phrase that we see in these records laws is this phrase, regardless of physical form. Again, this is a law that was written in the 1970s. But if it's a writing containing information related to the conduct of the public business, regardless of physical form, it's a public record. In other words, if you receive a citizen complaint, it doesn't matter if you receive that on a piece of paper, in an email, in a Twitter direct message, a Facebook comment, regardless of physical form, a complaint is a complaint, and can constitute a record that requires retention. So again, no new laws need to be created to represent the fact that social media is a public record. That being said, states have recognized that it's valuable to clarify the application of public records law to social media, and state after state has come out with guidance. Again, taking California just as one example, CalRIM, the Records Information Management Office, in 2015 published this e-records guidebook that makes it abundantly clear that social media does constitute public record and a unique record, and in certain circumstances they lay out the criteria. And essentially, if you're using social media in any meaningful way, you are generating public records that at least some set require retention of. So you can look at guidance like this for California, and one really key point to look for in the guidance is not only the fact that social media generates record, but that you need to do something about it. Here out of this e-records guidebook, in California, the records body is saying a plan to export records from a social media site to a record keeping system is important. Again, we see this in state after state. So if you're not in California, I'm going to give you a resource here in a minute to see what the guidance is in your state. But just to play this all the way through from theory to reality, we can look at public records law, we can look at the guides all day, but what does it mean in practice? There are real circumstances that are now popping up across the country. And again, taking California as an example, early in 2017, a citizen in San Mateo, the city of San Mateo, recognized that social media is public record, issued a records request to the police department, asking for some of the direct message content that the police department had received. Now, because the police department's Twitter account had been hacked and the direct messaging history had been deleted, the police department could not fulfill the records request. The citizen then seeing this happen, filed a lawsuit involving the city, the police department, and the mayor. And among other things, the lawsuit pointed out that the city did not have the appropriate policy and procedures in place to manage social media as a public record. So again, a lawsuit to make the point that social media is a record. That's the kind of awareness we're now seeing with journalists and citizens and advocacy groups and so forth. So very, very important to recognize the guidance in your state and the law that's been established. And again, you may not be in California, so if you're not, there is guidance likely in your state. And to help with that, we've put together this resource, bit.ly/SM Public Records is a short URL to get there. You can click on your state, see the records law, see the guidance if your state has published more guidance related to social media records. Again, many states have, and see the latest and greatest directly from the records authorities in your region. And finally, I mentioned that you may be receiving records requests for social media and you might not realize it yet. And what I mean by that is that the notion of a public records request that explicitly asks for Facebook and Twitter does exist. We do see them quite often. We didn't see them 5 or 6 years ago. We see them pretty frequently now. But by and large, most public records requests are not explicitly asking for Facebook or Twitter or YouTube content. They're asking for information related to a certain topic or incident. You can see these examples, all notifications of the school closure or street closure. Well, if you think about that and you think about how important social media is, it's very likely that you've actually used social media to communicate this kind of information. So if you receive a records request that says all notifications of the school closure, the records request doesn't explicitly ask for Facebook content, you might still need to include Facebook content. It may be that on Facebook, because of the real-time nature of closures, you actually communicated most of the valuable information on that platform, and to correctly and accurately and to respond to these records requests and do so in a manner that protects your agency, you should be thinking about your social media. So if you're interested in this, I have a few more case studies I will cover here in today's discussion, but we on our website also have published case study after case study of records requests and legal incidents involving social media, whether it's a weather event or some kind of controversial situation. And more than that, we know that a lot of you have talked to members of my team. If you are in a conversation with a member of my team, there are dozens upon dozens of records requests and legal requests that we encounter from the agencies we work with that we do not publish out there. But if you're working with a member of my team, ask about a records request in your county, in your state. It's very likely that we have an example we can share with you. It's very likely that we can reach out to that peer agency of yours and connect you, and you can talk to them about how they were able to navigate that tricky situation. Now, one thing I wanted to come back to was this notion of public officials. And I know a lot of you work with public officials, but you may not feel accountable for the public official's actions. In fact, you may not have enough authority to really direct the public official to do much of anything. You can give them good advice, but they are autonomous in a lot of ways. So what I want to do is share one example with you that may kind of reverse your thinking on the relationship between your agency, if you're a city or a county, and your public officials. I know a lot of you feel like there's a strong separation. And this example comes out of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where a citizen issued a records request for content on the mayor's Facebook page. Again, this is related to First Amendment. The mayor had removed some content or hidden some content. They issued this public records request to Chambersburg, the municipality itself. And they responded back saying, well, listen, hold on, this is the mayor's page. We didn't create the mayor's Facebook account. We don't manage it. We are not responsible for responding to this records request. This was actually escalated then to the Open Records Council in Pennsylvania, which is responsible for ruling upon public records requirements and issues like this. And the Open Records Council said, actually, because the mayor's page does have communications that constitute public business, and public business does then relate to public records. These communications are public records. You, Chambersburg, as an entity, are responsible for these. So it really tied together the municipality and the public official, even though a lot of us see a separation there, and said, you've got to figure this out. And we are seeing that trend. In fact, in our home city right now, city of Durham, the city actually worked very, very closely with its elected officials to institute a policy upon themselves to follow the same practices of the city. In fact, we had a webinar on that I think Robert will mention here later in case you're interested. So want to really flag this for all of you, that the public officials can generate a lot of controversy, can generate a lot of the spotlight. They may feel a bit more separate than they really are, and we are seeing now some more activity where you as an entity need to work more closely with your public officials and be on the same page with your policies and legal requirements. And on that note of public officials and entities needing to think about social media risk, no matter how important or powerful you are, nobody can escape the requirements of public records. Nobody can escape the fact that we have accountability and the need to be transparent. And that goes all the way up to the President of the United States. Robert already mentioned that we had the great privilege of working with the last presidential administration to launch the world's first archive of presidential social media. We continue to work with the Executive Office of the President. And so again, from the top levels all the way through some of the smallest towns and villages in the country, this is an important issue. So to summarize, we talked about First Amendment concerns. We talked about third-party content, the potential to go viral. We talked about in the event that there is a sticky circumstance, you need to produce records, and that not being able to produce records can make that circumstance a lot worse. So again, I'm going to pause here just for a moment, take a look at the questions we have, and perhaps we can address one or two.
Yeah, great. So Anil, actually, we got a number of questions around social media policy, which I know you're going to address later. Where should it be posted? What needs to be included, et cetera. So I'm not sure, do you want to hold off on that?
Yes, we're going to tackle that here just in a moment.
Great.
Okay, well, great segue then. We'll go ahead and take a look at some of the actionable items here in just a moment. We do have one more poll while I transition to that information. We'll go ahead and bring the poll up on your consoles. And we want to get a sense from all of you of how you are managing social media risk today. And again, our focus here, risk ultimately boils down to a circumstance where you need to tell your side of the story and validate your actions. Record keeping plays a huge role in this. So we want to get a sense of where you are in terms of record keeping. So we're waiting for the audience here to respond. We appreciate you doing that. And we've got just over half the audience with a response in now. We'll wait just another moment here for the rest of you to put a response in, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so looking at the results, there's the biggest bucket, about half of you are saying, I'm not sure, we don't have a plan. So great that you joined us here today. We are going to transition now from problem statement on this presentation to tactics that you can employ to protect your agency. And part of that is around record keeping, also on policy, as Robert just mentioned. Those of you relying on the social networks, we'll talk about that here in a moment. And then for the rest of you who are either manually archiving or using some kind of archiving solution, kudos to you for taking action, recognizing that the importance of records and doing something about it. Okay, so here's the question. How can you avoid social media lawsuits to protect your agency in the event of one, now that I've laid out the three major categories of risk? And as we just had a great setup for, we're going to talk about policy. And we have some guidance here. Again, we do a lot of work with public agencies, predominantly around record keeping, but again, all of these pieces of the puzzle fit together, and policy is so important. You have to set up the right expectations from the get-go, both internally and externally. And so here's our guidance. Number one, keep it simple. We know a lot of you have been through this pain. A lot of the agencies we work with have had to go through 18 months, 24 months of internal back and forth trying to get a policy together. And we know it's tough. We know there's a lot of important perspectives to bring into it. But as much as you can, try not to reinvent it. Look to an agency next door to you, around you, that's done this before. This is a solved problem in government, and it's good to get those best practices from others rather than try to reinvent it. You do want to have a policy that's both internal and then one that's external. Internal, letting your employees know what to expect, what the rules of the road are for their own social media usage, as well as for those who manage the official accounts. Employees do need to recognize public records requirements. They need to understand how to deal with comments and moderate them. So that's all for your internal usage. And then externally, your citizens need to know what to expect. Citizens need to know that your Facebook page, not only what you post, but what they say back to you constitutes public record. They need to know on Twitter, when they mention you, they direct message you, it constitutes public record. They also need to know the rules of the road of what you're allowing on these forums. As we saw with the Maryland situation, excessively repetitive content, for example, you need to tell them that. And so really important to have both sides of that policy, make it public, easy to find. Great practice is to put it on your website and then include a link to that social media policy in all of your social media profiles. And then it's not enough just to have a policy, you have to follow through and consistently enforce it. And we'll talk here in a moment about, particularly about deleting or hiding, but you want to be especially consistent on that given the First Amendment concerns and all of the activity we're seeing in that space. You don't want to remove content simply because it's critical or negative. Again, you don't want to discriminate on viewpoint, and you need to maintain records of everything because at the end of the day, you want to have this policy in place and then record keeping to come back and say, we did what we said we were going to do. So I mentioned not reinventing the wheel. How can we help you? We at Archive Social, given that we are in this space with and work so closely with well over 1,500 agencies now, we constantly monitor the space and pull together best practices. We put it in a social media policy template, and it's openly and freely available to all of you. So this is a resource we encourage you to take advantage of. And it's really just a bringing together of the best practices we're seeing from agencies around the country. And by the way, if you have a policy in place, good practice is to revisit it every 6 to 12 months as well. And honestly, leaving a webinar thinking about actionable items, if you do not have a policy ready to go, think about that Honolulu situation. The most critical thing you can do immediately is get a policy in place. All right, and we skipped ahead a little bit, so I'm going to come back on our recommendation number 2, which is having that policy in place. I mentioned that you need to enforce it well. That's hard to do in government when you have distributed staff, social media is distributed. So training has to be a priority here. You have to ensure that whoever is posting on social media involved with it understands the policy, understands how to consistently enforce it. And again, being consistent is very, very important. So how do you make that a little bit easier? We have another resource for you, and this is, again, credit to one of our customers, Wake County, North Carolina, that recognized that while they had the right legalese in their policy, that handing that policy straight to their employees may not have been the most effective way to get everybody to understand when to remove a content and when to leave it up. So they decided to use a really great tactic here, which is to create a flowchart, printed this out, gave it to all the social media managers, and then allowed us to share it with the rest of the world. So you're welcome to get a copy of this as well, where you can look at it and piece by point by point to say, okay, does this post have profane language? Okay, yes or no, and just follow that flowchart. And your social media managers have a really easy way to consistently enforce that policy. Okay, and number 3, no surprise, I think to a lot of folks here, as I've mentioned record keeping a few times now, at the end of the day, you have a policy, you enforce it, you will be pulled into legal situations, you will have controversy at some point, and you will need to tell your side of the story, and that's where record keeping comes in. This is something that I think that agencies already understand when it comes to email. As a really good example, social media is no different. You need to be able to tell your story with the records of your social media, what you said and what was said to you. So that, again, that's where archiving comes in, and there is a public records requirement to fulfill here. Remember that, again, it's not just what you say, though. It is also the comments, the messages from your citizens. So let me tell you a story that starts out as a scary circumstance, but actually has a happy ending that pulls this all together. And it happened in Margate, Florida, where a citizen was frequently posting comments and posts related to their own blog. The blog on the surface level looked almost like an official resource from the city, but it was actually the citizen's own blog and commercial in nature. And so the city, to their credit, they established a policy that prohibited this type of content. When the citizen was posting this information, they were very consistent about enforcing their policy. They trained their staff. They were removing that content. They were letting the citizen know. And when the citizen realized this was happening, the citizen filed a records request. Said, hey, this is the state of Florida. We have a sunshine law here. First of all, you can't remove my content. You need to have the records. And second, I feel like you're censoring me. Well, putting this all together, Margate was also archiving, and it is archiving today. It was able to instantly produce a report showing all the circumstances in which they had removed content. And the citizens really asked, show me all the times you've removed content to understand if the city was consistently enforcing the policy or if they were being singled out. And so again, putting it all together, having the policy, having the consistent approach based on training, and having the archive, the record keeping to tell your side of the story, the city was able to respond and nothing else came out of it. And that's exactly where you want to be. You want to be able to weather these circumstances so that by and large, you're benefiting from social media. When the occasional legal issue pops up, that issue isn't now front and center and bringing focus away from your social media efforts, distracting you from serving your citizens. You want to be able to handle these situations and move on and continue to reap the benefits of social media. Now, on the topic of archiving, I promised that I would touch on this. We do get a lot of questions about archiving in general, obviously our area of expertise. So I want to give you some high-level guidance on how to think about archiving. The truth is that social media records management is hard because unlike email, unlike other types of content like your website, social media is out of your control. It's actually quite easy to take a backup of your website or have version history built into your website system, your email systems. Many of your IT departments simply journal your email for you. But social media content fundamentally exists on Facebook servers and Twitter servers and YouTube servers. Even if you're not active, it's Saturday night, your citizens are still posting and editing and removing content, and it goes on without you. And so this is all out of your control. It's dynamic, and you really can't rely on the social network. We've actually done studies on this showing just how much content disappears from the social network, either because maybe someone in your agency deleted it, but more than likely a citizen decided to retract their own comment, they retract their own message. People quit Facebook. I'm sure you know someone who's quit Facebook. Well, when you quit Facebook, all of your content comes out. So there's a lot of ways that information disappears, and there's really no notification to you that you've just lost a government record that meets your record keeping requirements, right, off the network. So you need to do something about it. If you've ever tried to search for something on Facebook, very, very difficult to find and really respond to a true records request this way. And also, if you're taking screenshots, I know some of you are doing this manually. That's much better than no record, but you know it's a time-consuming, costly task in terms of your resources. And then if you needed to produce that record, how do you search screenshots? Do screenshots have all of the information? In certain states, Supreme Courts have ruled you need technical metadata, which is something that you won't capture in a screenshot. So a lot of shortcomings here, a lot of challenges if either you're relying on the network or trying to take manual records. And so that's really where archiving comes in. And so just to give you some guidance for what to look for in a social media archiving solution, you want to be near real time. Again, this data exists outside of your control. So you need to get it in your control as fast as possible before it's edited or deleted. As we all know, you've edited something before, I'm sure. Typically, you edit something or delete something shortly after you post it. So you really need to get it in your control quickly. Depending on the platform, you can get it, almost instantly, but at least within seconds or minutes. You don't want to wait 30 minutes or an hour or longer to try to get the data. It's likely that something that's been edited or deleted, you've already missed a record. The records need to be authentic. They need to be legally sound. You need to be able to use them in court. Again, this is all about protecting your agency, avoiding lawsuits. And so, again, a screenshot has some value, but it's something that can be disputed. So look at archiving approaches that can ensure that your records can serve as electronic legal evidence. When you have to tell your side of the story, it's not going to work if you have a mixed bag of 300 posts and comments all just kind of laid out in an Excel file. There's just no way to understand what happened. So you need to think about a record keeping approach that reconstructs, replays those conversations. There might be 7 comments that were part of one post and 15 comments part of another post. You need to be able to understand that full conversation, what comments were made before and after, how they all string together. Really, really important. you want to be able to do that, because if you don't, then it's possible that in responding to a records request, there's more confusion and more risk. So you need to be able to reconstruct. The fourth bullet here is really critical, something that I know a lot of folks don't think about, but the record keeping approach you have today that may be working, that may be keeping you compliant with law, may stop working tomorrow because Facebook changed something or Twitter changed something. These social networks are constantly evolving, adding new features, taking them away, making changes. There's no guarantee that they're going to make all the data available at all times. And so you need an approach that can really thrive despite the fact that social networks constantly change and have limitations. So really, really important to look at that, because it's not as simple as just saying, hey, I archived Facebook, I'm good to go, I'm compliant. What did you archive? Did you get all the timeline posts? Did you get the comments? Did you get the embedded photos, the live videos? And did you get that new feature that came out last week? Really, really important to pay attention to that. And at the end of the day, I'm laying out that this is kind of a complex issue. You want to look for an approach that makes this incredibly easy. This is social networking data. It's all in the cloud. The beauty of the cloud is that all of this can happen online. And so there are approaches out there where you can get compliant in 20 minutes, right? You want to keep this as simple as possible. No IT resources, no deployment. Solve a complex problem with a simple solution. That's ideal here. And that's really what archiving is about. So again, if you have more questions about that, we're happy to address that or take that offline. But we do get a lot of questions about, well, what does it really mean to have a social media archive? Here's a screenshot from one of our archives, the state of North Carolina, and the link to it. We mentioned we have an open archive with that contains the entire social media history of the Obama presidency. That's available online. You can search for it. A number of major government organizations like New York City and others have open archives. State of North Carolina here. Also, a lot of your typical towns and counties across the country have launched open archives. So something you can search for. But here's at least one link to go see a live social media archive. So I'm going to wrap up with one more. I know some of you are saying, but Anil, I want one more legal situation. You just haven't given me enough to fire me up. So I'm going to end with one more to really paint that picture of making this easy. And to be honest with you, a lot of the conversations I have around having a policy in place, having the training, having the record keeping, they're well received, where agencies tell me this makes sense. This is something that we need to do after we take care of our website and after we do this and that. And our social media policy, we probably have 6 more months on it. And I want to really make the point of now is the time, because when you do have a legal situation, it's too late, right? And so here's a good example that paints it. Here's Santa Barbara Police in California. We honestly had been reaching out to them, talking to them about archiving and policies. They were well aware of the issue, decided for a while that it wasn't a priority. And then one day, the officer said, you know what, I'll go ahead and set up a free trial and see what this is about. 3 weeks into the free trial, received their first social media records request related to the gun buyback program in the city that the police department was obligated to run, and it was from the National Rifle Association. So regardless of which side of the political spectrum you sit on, we all know this is a controversial issue. The NRA obviously has every right to make a records request. The program does need to be run correctly. And so a really, really important records request came in. And off of a free trial that was set up in a matter of minutes, the Santa Barbara PD was able to fulfill the records request and actually published a case study. So again, makes the point, again, regardless of which approach you take at the end of the day, think about what action you can take tomorrow with your policy, with your training, with your record keeping, and get ahead of the issue before it's too late. So I'm going to hand back to Robert, and then we'll take some questions. So Robert, back to you.
Okay, great, Anil. So while Anil takes a second to look through the questions, and actually, let me just ask everyone, we've got 5 or 10 good questions. If you have more questions, go ahead and post them in the questions window, and Anil will hop on in a second here. If there's anything you'd like to look at more, explore more with regards to archiving or any of the things Anil talked about, feel free to schedule a call with us. Basically, during the call, we'll talk about the public records guidance in your state. So if you're in the state of Virginia, we'll look at the guidance there in Virginia. We'll also talk, we can also talk to you about who's archiving near you. One of the interesting things we can do is give you an opportunity to actually see what your social media archive looks like. And this is a really cool feature. Basically, what we do is we set it up. There's no cost or anything, no commitment. and we set up your essentially your social media archive. And in just about 2 minutes, you can see what your archive looks like, and it's a really cool feature. And just take a look at your records requests and also learn a little bit more about pricing. A lot of people are surprised to know that this is a small ticket item, relatively, typically under $5,000. So if you're interested in this, type just schedule in the chat window, and we can reach out to you afterward. I'll send you an email right afterwards to schedule a call. Okay, so with that, I want to hit some questions here. Actually, Neil, if you can slide to the next slide here. Okay, just while we're doing that. Oh, and okay, so one other quick thing I just want to mention. We got a number of questions in the chat window around the comment moderation guide, that flow chart that Anil mentioned, as well as social media policy. We will send out a follow-up email that has links to both of those resources. We'll also include some links to other resources. So we do a monthly agency-to-agency webinar series, which is not us presenting, it's one of your peers. And this is everything from, as we show here, a couple of the examples. In January, Chief Menino from Park Forest, Illinois, outside Chicago, talked about social media best practices for law enforcement. All the way down 2 months ago, we had Amy Blaylock here in Durham share about public officials and this, as Anil mentioned, this policy that they put in place with their elected and appointed officials. These recordings are all online. You can also go to our site. We also have a number of ebooks, guides, etc. So, for instance, one example is with the International Institute of Municipal Clerks. We put out a pretty detailed ebook. It's about 30 pages detailing records retention guidelines for clerks around the country. So anyway, tons of resources online. Hopefully that's given Anil some time to look at questions. And so Anil, let me tee up a couple of these questions here. The first question, we had a lot of questions around First Amendment. So what are your recommendations for avoiding censorship with your social media policy? Can prohibiting certain content from a government site be considered censorship and a violation of the First Amendment?
A great question. And again, the comment moderation guide that Robert mentioned lays this out more clearly, but I do want to share just a few of the high level guidelines from that guide here right now. It's a really good point that you want to be careful about creating the perception of First Amendment violation. So a general principle that we see accepted across the industry is this notion of opinion versus content, right? You do not want to set yourself up to hide or remove content based on opinion. Opinion being, I agree with you or disagree, I agree with that issue, I disagree with that issue. Just because someone agrees or disagrees or has an opinion on something is not a good reason to censor them, right? That's actually where we see a lot of agencies and public officials step into trouble. On the other hand, content, you can define some clear rules about what is acceptable content and what is not. I think we can all agree that pornography, hate speech, racial slurs, copyrighted material, that's content that objectively you can point out and say this is either content that is allowed here or not. And so you want to keep your policy oriented around content. Now, I'm going to pause there because we do have this detailed out in our comment moderation guide. And again, we use the policies and best practices from agencies across the country, but hopefully that gives you a starting point on the issue. Okay,
great. Thanks, Anil. And again, we'll send that out in the follow-up email. We had another question, and we had a couple around elected and appointed officials. So one question here, I'm aware of a neighborhood Facebook page that is private, but I know that I have council members active on it. Is that page responsive? I don't have access to it.
And I'm reading into the question a little bit. If the question is about that page potentially being subject to records law and the records requirements, the simple answer is if public business is being conducted and communicated upon, you're generating public records. To be honest with you, we see this a lot. Council members don't quite have the awareness that we'd like them to have about this issue. I see it on my own neighborhood Facebook page where council members will talk about city-related issues. Those by law, and we've seen a number of examples now raised across the country in which this has become front page news, those by law are public record. So the guidance we want to give these council members and public officials is if you're going to conduct public business, do it in a forum in which we can keep records and in which we are following the policies. A lot easier to ask them to do that than for them to follow through, but we need to at least start there.
Okay, great. So Neil, another question, should we be keeping all messages on Facebook? And actually, let me add a second question that we got to it. Somebody had asked, what's the difference between social media and email? We delete email records. Why not social media?
Yeah.
Let me wrap both of those
Really
together.
good question. I do think those two questions tie together nicely. So for those of you who are records management geeks like I am, you've probably been thinking throughout this, but wait, not everything is a record worth retaining. And that's true. So to the question about email, there are retention schedules that apply to all sorts of written communications, including email. The best practice is to set those retention schedules based on the content of the message. So if your message is, hey, I hope you have a great weekend, that's probably not a record worth keeping very long. If the message is related to a crime or a complaint or some kind of legislative action, it falls under a different retention schedule. That's true for email. It's true for social media too. So very clearly, not everything on social media needs to be kept as a long-term record. I think we all know that. We look at some of those comments and we know there's a lot of silly temporary comments posted on social media. But in that mix, there is also critical information. Somewhere in there, if you're using social media, someone is saying something to you that is a long-term record, whether it's a crime tip, whether again it's a complaint or something else like that. So very, very true that we don't need to keep everything forever, that you can also determine the length of retention. Just like you do with email, you can do that with social media. In our platform, we support that. One important point though with social media is that unlike email, it's out of your control. Before you can curate it, you need to capture it. You need to have control of it, and then you can make an assessment of how long to keep it. And the reality is with the volume of social media content and communications that you all have, it's a lot easier just to keep it longer than you need to, because you probably don't have the time to curate it. But if you do want to curate it, you need to capture it first, apply it to a retention schedule, and then you can dispose it to that schedule just like you do with email.
Okay, great. So another question, it seems like the majority of the issues discussed seem to directly relate to Facebook comments where we have the most control over moderation. How do you address Twitter where you have little control over mentions and comments?
That's a really good point, and it accurately reflects what we see in the space. A majority of the legal issues, concerns raised do center around Facebook. Facebook is the 800-pound gorilla in the social media space. But that being said, your point is exactly true that there are these other networks and these issues do apply just as equally to those other networks. Twitter's obviously a big network as well. Now, because Twitter mentions do not show up attached to your tweets, they can thread them together, not really a part of your tweet. There's no Twitter page in which your mentions will just sit there and you can then moderate them. It somewhat avoids the issues. So essentially, because you can't hide or delete those Twitter mentions for someone else, it doesn't raise the First Amendment concerns. And again, Twitter sometimes decides to inline people's mentions, sometimes not. It's kind of a weird animal in terms of those conversation threads. We haven't seen, as a result, we haven't seen these types of issues crop up. That being said, I'm not saying, I'm not at all alluding to the, public records not applying to Twitter. So if you get a mention from someone on Twitter, it's a received communication. You do need to keep that record, and that person can still delete what they said to you. You get a direct message, for example, you still need to keep that record. So the issues do apply. It's just that the First Amendment concern doesn't quite come up. Now, on other platforms like Pinterest or YouTube, you have conversation threads that are more like Facebook, and those exact First Amendment concerns do apply. Even if we haven't seen as much case law, you do want to think holistically about your social media presence.
Okay, great. So another question here. I manage our social media accounts at the college I work at. Do you have any examples or case studies about how social media archiving has helped in situations like cyberbullying or school shootings, for example? I know I've got one example. Neil, do you?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one example with an agency we work with, this was actually not a college, but in a K-12 school district. There had been a parent that had posted online complaining that their child was being bullied, and the agency had replied back appropriately had quickly replied back and said, hey, can we take this, essentially saying, can we take this offline? Can you please, direct, here's our contact info, can you direct message? The challenge is when the parent then deletes that record, there's no, the school has no record of essentially responding to that parent. And then the parent's complaining, hey, you didn't respond. I complained that my student was being bullied. So that's the type of thing where it's not a lawsuit, but it's a complaint for a parent. And then we've had some other situations where schools, we had one in Virginia where there was a threat of a school shooting, and the school got it through. It was actually not on the school's page, it was on another page. A student then posted about it on the school page, and the school was able to get in touch with local law enforcement. I don't know, Neil, if you have other ones that.
Well, and honestly, this is one that I want to be careful with because it's fairly recent, but with the Parkland shootings as well, a number of municipalities in that area were affected on social media. And a silver lining on this, social media, we've seen time and time again, really powerful channel doing these types of crisis situations, going back to hurricanes, mass shootings in 2016. And in Parkland, the Broward County Sheriff, who you may have seen on national media and others, seeing a significant response on social media. So a lot of the circumstances that we've seen kind of transcend the school presence itself to then the law enforcement and the cities and counties around that situation. So very, very relevant question, and it really brings to light the fact that crisis situations, more than anything, do spur records requests and public record situations.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anil. I think we will have one last question here. And again, some of the questions that we don't get to, just because we're right up on the hour, we'll respond privately offline. How about, I'm just trying to think here in the last one, any thoughts about the argument that the public entity is not the custodian of the records and therefore under no obligation to archive and retain? That's a great doozy of a question for our last question.
I'm glad you asked that. Do I have thoughts on that? I absolutely do. And it comes up, and it's not unreasonable to ask the question, well, who's really responsible for this? The question has been asked time and time again across the country, and there's been a definitive answer. These records on Facebook and Twitter are not Facebook's responsibility when it comes to public records law. They're yours. And the really easy analogy to take is email. 10 years ago, I'm sure email was running on your own local server, right? And certainly your IT department's running the server. The emails are coming into you. You're responsible for them, very clear. Maybe in the recent past or maybe in the future, you move to cloud-based email. You're on Office 365. Does that mean that records requirements now move the responsibility, the custodian responsibility, to Microsoft? No, of course not. You've made a decision as a public entity to use some technology to host your communication platform, but you've made the decision to communicate out. You've made the decision to create a form to receive communications. That's exactly what happens on Facebook and these other channels. And once you've opened up the platform to transmit and receive this communication, you are responsible for the sent and received communications under public records law as the public entity.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Anil. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We had a great turnout today. Over 400 people were registered for this, so this is fantastic. Again, we'll send out a follow-up email in the next 24 hours with the resources, and please keep in touch. Thanks.